The man who ruined the finest evening of my career came in wearing a gray wool coat that had seen 10 winters, and I nearly turned him away myself. I want to be honest about that because I have told this story enough times now to know that people expect me to have known. They lean in and ask, "But surely you could tell." As if a man's worth prints itself on his face like a reservation on a card. It does not. I was 23. I had been floor host at Munier's for 4 months, and I was standing at the reservation podium under the great brass lamp when the door opened and let in the cold, and a man stepped through who did not belong to any category I had been trained to recognize. He was tall, but he held his height the way careful men do, folded down a little so as not to loom. His hair was iron and short. His face was weathered the way stone near the sea is weathered, not old exactly, but used, worked on by things I could not name. The coat was clean and pressed and entirely wrong. Everyone else who came through that door on a Friday in the cold months arrived sheathed in the armor of money, the dark tailored overcoats, the watches that cost more than my year, the perfume that announced itself 3 steps ahead. This man smelled of soap and rain. His shoes were polished to a shine you could read by, and that should have told me something, because only 2 kinds of people polish their shoes like that, servants and soldiers, and neither of them was the kind Muniers expected on a Friday night. "Good evening," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of a man who has learned to make himself heard without ever raising it. "I have a reservation, Ashe, for 1 at 8. I looked down at the book. Munier still kept a leather reservation book in those days, even though the bookings all lived in the tablet too. The book was theater, and theater was half of what our guests paid for. I ran my finger down the 8 o'clock line, and there it was, in Mr. Delisle's own slanted hand. ASHE 1800 window. A window table. The window tables at Munier's were not given out. They were bestowed. They looked over the river and the lit bridge and the far bank where the old spire stood. And on a Friday in the cold season, a window table was the difference between a good night and a night people talked about for a year. I remember the small confusion that moved through me. The name was in the book. The table was the best in the house, and the man in front of me looked like he had come to fix the boiler. Before I could speak, Mr. Delisle arrived. I should tell you about Delisle, because the whole of what happened turns on the kind of man he was, and it would be too easy to make him a villain. He was not a villain. He was the maître d'hôtel of Munier's, and he had made himself over 30 years into a perfect instrument for one task, protecting the idea of the place. Munier's did not sell food. It sold the feeling of belonging to a world where everything was correct, where nothing common was ever allowed to touch you, where the mere fact of your presence proved you were among the chosen. Delisle guarded that feeling like a dragon guards gold. He could read a coat, a cuff, a way of standing, the way a physician reads a pulse, and he had built his whole life on the certainty that he was never wrong. He came gliding out from the dimness beyond the lamp, silver-haired in his black tailcoat, and he took in the man in the gray coat with one downward sweep of his eyes, coat, shoes, the plain steel watch, the absence of any of the signals he lived by, and I watched a decision close behind his face like a shutter. "Good evening," Delisle said, and his good evening was a different animal from mine. Mine had been a greeting. His was a wall with a small window in it. "May I help you?" "Ashe," the man said again, unbothered. "A reservation for 1, 8 o'clock. "I'm afraid," Delisle said, and he let the phrase hang there polished, "that I don't have you in my book." Now this was a lie, and I knew it was a lie because the book was open under my hand and I was looking at the name. I felt my mouth open. I felt Delisle's attention flick to me 1 degree, the smallest possible movement, and it carried an entire sentence, not 1 word. I closed my mouth. I was 23 and 4 months in, and Delisle could end me with a phone call, and so I did the thing I am least proud of in the whole of that evening. I said nothing. I let the book stay open, and I let the lie stand. The man in the gray coat did not argue. That was the first thing about him that I could not fit into my understanding of people. Everyone argued. Everyone who was ever refused at that podium argued, escalated, named names, produced a phone with the confirmation glowing on it, demanded the manager, went red, went loud. This man simply looked at Delisle for a moment, a long, quiet, unhurried moment, and I had the strange sensation of watching a man take a very accurate measurement. "You have me at 8, he said. "A window table. Mr. Delisle, I believe." The use of the name landed. Delisle had not given it. For half a breath something uncertain moved in the older man's eyes, and then his training reasserted itself, because a man like Delisle cannot afford uncertainty. Uncertainty is the crack that brings the whole edifice down. He gathered himself, and he smiled the smile he used on people he had decided did not matter. "Sir," he said, "Muniers has a certain standard. I'm sure you understand. Perhaps another evening at another establishment you would be more comfortable. We're fully committed tonight. I do apologize." Fully committed. The window table sat empty behind us, laid for one, the crystal catching the lamplight. 3 other tables sat empty besides. I have gone over that moment 10,000 times, and I still cannot fully explain why I said nothing, except that fear is a very ordinary thing, and it does its work quietly, and most of the shameful silences in the world are exactly that, plain. The man nodded slowly, as though Delisle had told him something he found interesting rather than insulting. "I understand," he said, "and here is the part that I have never been able to forget, the part that made the rest of the evening what it was. He was not angry. There was no wound in his face, no flush of humiliation, no scramble for dignity. He had been refused entry to one of the most exclusive rooms in the capital by a man who thought him a nobody, and he received it the way a mountain receives weather. It passed over him and left him unchanged. "Might I wait a moment," he said, "before I go, only to warm up? It's cold on the river." Delisle's instinct was to say no. I could see it. But even Delisle could not throw a man back out into the cold for asking to stand by the door for a minute, not with 2 couples coming up the steps behind him and the whole cultivated warmth of Muniers spilling out to be seen. "Of course," Delisle said, in a voice that made it a favor of enormous magnitude, and he turned to sweep the arriving couples inside. All warmth again, the wall gone, the window opened wide for people whose coats were the right coats. The man in gray stepped a little aside out of the flow and stood near the tall window by the door, looking out at the river and the lit bridge. I could see his reflection in the dark glass laid over the water. He did not take out a phone. He did not fume. He simply stood, hands loose at his sides, weight even on both feet, his eyes moving once across the room and back to the window, and I realize now, telling you this, that he stood like that the entire time, and that the stance had a name I did not know yet. He was standing his post. He was a man for whom stillness was not waiting but a discipline, a thing done on purpose, and I had never in my life seen anyone hold themselves so completely still and so completely alert at the same time. It was the stillness of a man who could move very fast if he had to and had decided, for now, not to. I went back to my podium. My face was hot. I busied myself with the book so I would not have to look at him, and that is the shape of cowardice. That busy work, that sudden fascination with a leather book so you need not meet the eyes of the person you have failed. The evening went on. Muniers filled the way it always did, table by table, the room warming with talk and candlelight and the small music of silver on porcelain. Delisle moved through it like a conductor, and he was magnificent at it, I will give him that. There was no one better in the city at making a room of rich people feel that they were exactly where they deserved to be. I seated the couples with the right coats. I recited the specials. I smiled. And the whole time the man in the gray coat stood by the window, and no one paid him any mind, and I told myself he would leave soon, and I would never have to think about him again. He did not leave. He stood by the window as the minutes stacked up, 5, 10, 15, patient as a stone in a stream, and I began to feel a low prickle of unease that I could not account for. A man who has been refused leaves. He storms off, or he slinks off, but he goes. The whole logic of the refusal is that he goes. This man stayed, and his staying was not a sulk and it was not a scene. He was simply there, by the window, with the calm of someone who has all the time in the world and knows exactly how the evening is going to end, even if no one else in the room does. At the podium, the telephone rang. I want you to understand what the telephone at Munier's was. It was not a phone the way your phone is a phone. It was an old instrument, black, heavy, with a real bell inside it, kept on a shelf below the podium, and it almost never rang because Munier's did not take bookings by voice. You booked through the concierge service, or you were known, and if you were known, you did not need to call. In 4 months, I had answered that telephone perhaps a dozen times, and every time it had been something trivial. So when it rang at 8:30, its old bell shivering up through the shelf, I answered it the way I always did, half my attention still on the room. Munier's, good evening. There was a small pause on the line. Then a woman's voice, very clear, very calm, the kind of calm that is not the absence of authority but the deepest form of it. Good evening, she said. I am calling from the office of the household. To whom am I speaking? I did not in that first instant understand. The office of the household. The words meant nothing arranged in my head, they were just words. This is the floor host, I said. How can I help you? I'll need to speak with your maître d'hôtel, the woman said. It concerns a guest of yours this evening, a Mr. Ashe. He was booked for 8 o'clock at the window. Something cold went down the back of my neck. One moment, I said. My voice had gone thin. I set the heavy receiver down on the shelf with a care I did not know I possessed, and I went to find Delisle. He was at the far side of the room, bent at the elbow of a table of financiers, sharing some confidence that made them all laugh, the low, satisfied laugh of men who are being flattered exactly as they wish to be. I waited at the edge of the light until he felt me there and turned, and the flick of irritation on his face at being interrupted was so automatic that even now I can see it. There's a call, I said low. The office of the household, they're asking for you, about Mr. Ashe. I watched the name land on him. I watched it not land at first. Ashe meant nothing to him. He had already thrown Ashe away, and then I watched the other words arrive and do their work. The office of the household. Delisle had spent 30 years in a world that orbited, at its very center and highest point, one household. He knew what those words meant the way a sailor knows what a change in the wind means. The color did not leave his face all at once. It left it in stages, the way the light leaves a room at dusk, so that if you were not watching closely you might not have seen it go at all. But I was watching closely. I have never in my life watched anything so closely. The office of the household, he repeated, very quietly. They said Mr. Ashe, the 8 o'clock, the window. Delisle straightened. He set down with great care the bottle he had been about to pour. He looked across the length of his own beautiful room, past the candles and the crystal and the financiers, to the tall window by the door where a man in a gray wool coat stood as still as a sentry, looking out at the river. And I saw, for the first time in the 4 months I had known him, Mr. Delisle afraid. He went to the telephone the way a man goes to a thing he already knows will hurt him. I followed, because I could not have stopped myself. There are moments when your feet make decisions your mind has not caught up to. He lifted the receiver and turned his back a little to the room, dropping his voice to the register he kept for emergencies. This is Delisle, he said. The maître d'hôtel, how may I be of service? I could not hear the woman's side of it. I could only hear his, and his side was a slow and terrible education. He said, yes, he said, of course, he said, yes, madam. And then he said a thing that made the last of the color go out of him entirely. I understand that the arrangements were made from your office. I do apologize, there seems to have been a confusion at the door. A confusion at the door. I nearly laughed, and it would have been a laugh with no joy in it at all, because I had watched the confusion at the door, and it had not been confusion. It had been a decision, made in one sweep of the eyes, that this man did not matter. The woman said something more. Delisle listened. His jaw had gone tight. "Might I ask," he said, and there was a new caution in it, the caution of a man walking on ice he has just realized is thin. "Who I have the honor of, that is, the gentleman himself. Might I ask his standing, so that we may receive him properly?" Whatever she told him, it took some time. I watched his face receive it. Delisle had a face built over 30 years to give nothing away, and it gave nothing away now, but a man's body knows things his face is hiding. His free hand found the edge of the shelf and held it. When he spoke again, his voice had changed key entirely. The wall was gone. The window was gone. What was left was a man discovering, all at once, the full dimensions of a mistake. "Of course, madam," he said. "At once. He will want for nothing. You have my personal word." A pause. "Thank you, yes, thank you." He set the receiver down as though it were made of glass. For a moment he did not move. He stood with his back to his beautiful room, his hand still on the shelf, and I stood beside him, and neither of us said anything. Then he turned and looked at me, and I have never forgotten the look on his face, because it was the look of a man who has spent his whole life certain he could read the world, and has just been shown, in the space of one telephone call, that the world he could read was only the shallow top of a deeper one he had never learned to see at all. "Do you know who that is?" he said. It was not really a question. It was a man trying to steady himself by saying words out loud. "No," I said. "That," said Delisle, "is Corvin Ashe." He said the name the way you would say a word in a language you had only just discovered you did not speak. "He is a sword of the household, a king's own guardsman. That call," he stopped and swallowed. "That call was from the private office of the Princess Adela. The table was booked by Her Highness. Personally, it is his name day. She arranged this dinner for him as an honor because he did not finish. Later I would learn the rest of it, the whole of it, and it was larger and stranger than anything Delisle could have said standing there by the telephone. But in that moment all Delisle had was the shape of it, and the shape was enough. He had turned away from his own door on the coldest night of the winter, a man the crown itself had chosen to honor. He had lied to him. He had told him he would be more comfortable somewhere else. He had done it in front of his own junior host, and he had made that host complicit in it with a single glance. And now the truth of it was standing by the window, patient as stone, waiting to see what kind of men we were. I understand now that Corvin Ashe had known the whole time. That is the part people find hardest to believe. He had known his name was in the book. He had known the table was his, that it had been arranged for him by a princess of the realm, that he had every right in the world to walk past Delisle and sit down at his window and be served like the honored guest he was. He had watched Delisle decide he was a nobody, and he had let the decision stand, and he had gone to the window and waited, not to make a scene, not to catch us out, but because he was a man who had spent his life learning that the true measure of people is taken not when they are being watched by someone important, but when they believe they are dealing with someone who does not matter at all. He had given us the whole evening to be better than we were. And we had failed him at the door, and he had simply stood by the window and let us fail, and waited, with the terrible patience of the disciplined, for the call that would show us what we had done. "Go," Delisle said to me. His voice cracked on the single word. "Go, and no, I will go." He drew himself up. Whatever else he was, Delisle was not a coward when the reckoning finally came. He was many things, but at the moment of the reckoning he took it on his own shoulders. He smoothed the front of his tailcoat with two flat hands, a gesture I had seen him make 1,000 times before greeting a lord or a magnate, and he set out across his own room toward the man in the gray coat, and I went with him, because I had been part of the wrong and I would be part of whatever came next, and because I could not have kept away for anything on earth. Corvin Ashe watched us come. He had turned from the window at some point, I do not know when, and he watched the two of us cross the room toward him, the old maître d' and the young host, and there was nothing in his face that I could name as triumph. If anything, there was a kind of patience, a readiness, as though he had been standing there precisely to see how we would do this, and was interested in the answer. Delisle stopped before him, and then Mr. Delisle, who had bowed to bankers and murmured to ministers, and never once in 30 years lowered his head to a soul he did not think outranked him, inclined from the waist, a small bow, but a real one, the first honest thing I had seen him do all night. "Mr. Ashe," he said, "I owe you an apology that no words of mine are equal to. I turned you from this door. I lied to you when I did it. There is no confusion to blame and no one to blame but myself. Your table is ready as it was always ready. If you will still honor us by taking it, it would be more than we deserve." I held my breath. I think the whole near corner of the room held its breath, though the room did not yet know why. There is a kind of gravity to a moment like that, and people feel it even when they cannot see its source. A table of guests nearby had gone quiet. Somewhere a fork had stopped halfway to a mouth. Corvin Ashe looked at Delisle for a long moment. Then he did a thing I did not expect, a thing that undid me a little standing there. He smiled. It was not a cold smile, and it was not a smile of victory. It was a warm and slightly tired smile, the smile of a man who has seen a great deal of the world and has decided, against considerable evidence, to keep thinking well of it where he can. "You said one true thing tonight," Ashe told him, "when you finally said it just now. That is more than most men manage. I've stood at a great many doors, Mr. Delisle. I've been on the other side of one or two like yours. I know how easy it is to mistake the wrapping for the thing inside." He glanced once at the gray coat he wore, and there was the faint dry humor of a man entirely at peace with how little he looked like what he was. "I'll take the table, on one condition." "Anything?" Delisle said. "Name it." "The young man," said Ashe, and he turned his eyes to me and I felt them land like a hand on the shoulder. "He's had a hard night's schooling, I think. He knew the name was in the book. I saw him see it, and I saw what it cost him to say nothing. He was not accusing me. That was the worst of it and the best of it. He was simply telling me that he had seen me, all of me, the whole of my small cowardice, and had not thrown me away for it. I'd like him to bring my wine, if he's willing. A man should learn what a door is for from the inside as well as the out." I said yes. I do not think I said it aloud at first. I think I only nodded and then found my voice somewhere and said, "Yes, sir. I'm yes." And Corvin Ashe nodded back once as if a matter had been settled between us, and let Delisle lead him at last to the window table that had been his all along. If the story ended there, the apology, the table, the honored guest seated at his window over the river, it would already be a story I would tell for the rest of my life. But it did not end there. It had, in fact, barely begun, because Munier's on a Friday night in the cold season was a room full of powerful people who did not yet know what had happened, and one of them was about to learn it in the worst possible way, and the whole of what Corvin Ashe would be dragged out into the candlelight before the evening was done. Let me first tell you what I learned that night about the man I had turned from the door, because you cannot understand what came after unless you understand what he was, and I did not understand it then. I gathered it in pieces from Delisle, who had it from the woman on the telephone, from the sommelier, who was old and had served in the household kitchens in his youth, and knew the names that the rest of us did not, and later in the years after from the man himself. On the rare evenings he came back to Munier's, and asked for me by name, and let me sit with him a while when the room had thinned. A sword of the household is not a ceremonial thing. I had thought, when Delisle first said it, that it meant one of the still red-coated figures you see at the palace gates, the ones the crowds photograph, the ones who are supposed to stand like statues while people wave and gawk. And Corvin Ashe had been one of those once in his younger years, had stood his hours at the gate in the tall bearskin and the red wool, unmoving, while tourists made faces at him and tried to make him flinch and never could. But that was the beginning of what he was, not the whole of it. The swords of the household are the innermost guard of the king's person, chosen out of the whole of the guard for something that cannot be taught, a steadiness under weight, and they are the men who stand nearest the crown when the crown is in danger. They are trained past the point where most men break. They are the last thing between the king and the world, and they are chosen precisely because they are the kind of men who will let a maître d'hôtel call them a nobody and turn them into the cold and never say a word about who they are. Because a man who needs the world to know his importance is a man who cannot be trusted to stand quietly in the dark and wait. And Corvin Ashe was more even than that. This is the part the old sommelier told me in the pantry, his hands shaking a little as he decanted the wine I was to carry, because he had been there in the household all those years ago when it happened. There had been, in a spring long before my birth, an attempt on the life of the king, not the old king, the king's father, in the days when Alaric was still a boy prince. A man with a knife had come out of a crowd at a public appearance, come fast and low and murderous, the way such men come, and in the half-second that decides everything a young guardsman had stepped off his post and into the path of the blade and taken the boy prince down out of the way and put himself where the knife was meant to go. He had lived. It had been a near thing, a matter of a hand's breadth and a great deal of the guardsman's blood on the cobbles, and for it he had been given by the old king's own hand, the highest honor the realm bestows for valor, the Cross of Valour, and something rarer than the cross, which cannot be pinned to a coat, the trust of the man he had saved, and of that man's son after him. The young guardsman was Corvin Ashe, the boy prince he had put himself in front of, whose life he had bought back with his own blood on a spring morning 50 years gone, was the child who grew up to be King Alaric. And the Princess Adela, the king's sister, who had booked the window table at Munier's in her own hand, and called from her private office when she learned, somehow, that her old family's oldest friend had been turned away at the door on his name day. The Princess Adela had been a little girl at that public appearance too, close enough to have seen the knife, close enough to have never in the whole of her life forgotten the man who came off his post to stand between it and her brother. To her, he was not a guardsman. He was the reason her family had a king. And she had arranged this quiet dinner, one table by a window on a cold Friday, as a private honor, no ceremony, no press, no announcement, because Corvin Ashe would have refused all of that, and she knew it, just a good table, a good bottle, a river view, a small kindness on the name day of a man who had never once in 50 years asked for anything for himself. That was the man I had helped turn into the cold. I carried the wine to his table with hands I had to will to be steady. He watched me come, and when I reached him he did not let me do the pantomime of the presentation, the label shown, the taste poured, the murmured question. He simply said, "Sit down a moment if they'll spare you," and gestured at the second chair, and I sat, because a man who has bought back a king with his own blood may ask a junior host to sit, and the junior host will sit. "You did a hard thing badly tonight," he said to me, not unkindly, pouring his own wine with a soldier's economy of motion. "And now you're going to spend a while thinking you're a coward, so let me save you some of that time." He set down the bottle. "You're not a coward. A coward is a man who does the wrong thing and feels nothing. You did the wrong thing and it burned you the whole while you were doing it. I watched it burn you. That's not cowardice. That's a conscience that hasn't yet learned it's stronger than fear. It will. Give it a few more years and a few more doors and it will." I did not trust myself to speak, so I only nodded. "The trick of it," he went on, looking out at the river, at the lit bridge and the black water, "is that the important people are almost never the ones who look important. The men who need you to know they matter, the loud ones, the ones in the right coats who make a maître d', those are mostly frightened men wearing armor. The ones who actually carry weight tend to be quiet, because they've carried it long enough to know it isn't a thing you show off. So a man in your trade, a man at a door, has to decide early what kind of doorman he'll be, the kind who serves the coat, or the kind who serves the person. He turned his eyes back to me. Tonight you learned there's a difference. That's worth more than the wine, and this is a very good bottle. I have carried those words for the whole of my life. But I could not tell him that then, because it was in that exact moment. Corvin Ashe seated at last at his window, the wine poured, the wrong half mended, the room warm and golden around us, that the door of Munir's opened again, and let in the cold, and let in the man who would turn the whole quiet evening into something none of us would ever forget. His name was Roland Cassius Vane, and he owned a great deal of the city, and he wanted everyone to know it. He came in the way certain men come into a room they believe they have purchased simply by entering it. He came in loud. He came in trailing a party of 6 associates, hangers-on, a young couple who laughed at everything he said a half-second before he finished saying it. And he came in with the special, dreadful confidence of a man who has never in his adult life been told no by anyone he could not fire. His overcoat was the right coat, the coat Delisle lived to greet, black cashmere over a suit that cost what Munir's paid me in a season, and a watch on his wrist that he wore turned slightly outward so that it would catch the light. He was perhaps 50, thick through the shoulders, with a broad, handsome face going soft at the edges and eyes that moved over a room taking inventory of who was worth his attention and who was not. Delisle went to him at once, of course. Whatever the man had done that night, Vane was a regular of the most valuable kind, one of the 20 or so people in the city whose custom made Munir's what it was, and Delisle greeted him with the full warmth of the house, the wall down, the window wide, all the ceremony that a man like Vane had come precisely to receive. And I watched Vane accept it as his due, barely glancing at Delisle, the way you barely glance at a door that opens for you, and I felt something turn over in my stomach, because I had spent the whole evening watching one man be treated as a nobody who was worth everything, and now I was watching another be treated as everything who was, I already suspected, worth a great deal less. Vane's party was seated at the large round table in the center of the room, the table for people who wished to be seen, and for a while it was only noise, the ordinary noise of a rich man holding court, and I thought perhaps the two halves of the evening would never touch. But they touched. Of course they touched. Because Roland Vane, settling into his chair with a glass already in his hand, let his inventory-taking eyes travel across the room, across the financiers, across the two couples with the right coats, until they came to rest on the window table, on the man in the gray wool coat that had seen 10 winters, sitting alone over the river with a young host who ought to have been at his podium. And Roland Vane, who missed very little and understood almost nothing, decided he had found something amusing. "You," he called out, not to me, past me, to Delisle, but at a volume that carried the length of the room, the volume of a man who wants an audience and has never doubted he deserves one. "Delisle, come here." Delisle went. Vane did not lower his voice for the private word. He made his question a performance for the whole table, for the whole room. "Who's the fellow at the good table? The window's my table, Delisle. You know that's my table when I want it. And you've got what is that, a delivery driver? Sitting at it in a coat off a market stall, drinking what I can see from here is a very good bottle, on a Friday. At my window." He laughed, and his table laughed with him, the young couple a half-second early. "Have standards slipped so far while I was away? Should I take my custom to a room that still has a door?" I felt the whole thing tilt. I saw Delisle's face, and Delisle was in an agony I would not have wished on any man, because Delisle knew exactly who sat at the window and could not say so. The whole point of the princess's dinner was that there be no announcement, no scene, no fuss, and to blurt out across the room that the man in the gray coat was a sword of the household, and a holder of the Cross of Valour, and the personal guest of the king's own sister, would have been a violation of the very honor Ashe had been brought here to receive. Delisle was trapped between two masters of etiquette, the loud one who paid his wages and the quiet one who outranked every soul in the room by a distance none of them could imagine, and he stood there in the candlelight with his mouth working and no words coming out. "He is a valued guest, sir," Delisle managed at last. "As are you. I hope you'll allow me to seat you comfortably at your usual." "I don't want my usual," Vane said, and the good humor was thinning in his voice now, the way it does in men like Vane the instant they are not immediately obeyed. "I want the window. I always have the window." "And instead you've given it to," he flapped a hand toward Ashe, dismissive, contemptuous, a gesture that took in the gray coat and the plain watch and the whole quiet person of the man, and threw them away exactly as Delisle himself had thrown them away at the door an hour before that. "Move him. Give him a nice quiet table by the kitchen, if you must feed him at all, and put me where I belong." Through all of this Corvin Ashe had not moved. He sat with his back 3/4 to the room, looking out at the river, and if you had not known better you would have thought he had not heard a word. But I was close to him, and I had learned in the last hour a little of how to read him, and I could see that he had heard every word, and that not one of them had gone anywhere near the place inside him where a man keeps his dignity. He turned his glass a slow quarter-turn on the white cloth. He was, I understood, doing again exactly what he had done at the door. He was waiting. He was letting the room decide what kind of room it was. It was Vane who could not leave it alone. Men like Vane never can. Silence, to a man like Vane, is a challenge. A man who does not react is a man who has not yet been shown his place. He rose from his chair. I saw Delisle move to intercept and be waved off with a flat hand. And he crossed the room to the window table with the heavy, rolling confidence of a man who has decided to enjoy himself. And he stood over Corvin Ashe, and he looked down at him the way you look down at a thing that is in your way. "Are you deaf, friend?" Vane said. "That's my table. Whoever let you in made a mistake. I heard there was a bit of a mix-up at the door earlier, and frankly they had the right idea the first time. This isn't a room for men in coats like yours, so be a good fellow. Finish your glass on me, I'm not a monster, and take yourself off somewhere you can afford to breathe. There's a decent enough place 2 streets down. You'll be more comfortable." You'll be more comfortable. The very words Delisle had used at the door. I heard them land, and I saw the corner of Ashe's mouth move, very slightly, not into a smile exactly, but into something that acknowledged the terrible symmetry of it. The same sentence, twice in one evening from 2 different men, both of them so certain of their own eyes. And then Corvin Ashe turned at last in his chair and looked up at Rayland Vane. And he spoke, for the first time since Vane had entered, in that low, level voice that filled the whole silence of the room without ever rising to fill it. "Sit down, Mr. Vane," he said. "Before you say a thing in front of all these people, that you'll spend a good deal of money trying to make them forget." For a moment Vane simply stared. I think it had been so long since anyone had said a plain, hard sentence to him that the machinery of his understanding jammed. He had come over expecting to enjoy a small cruelty, to be looming and generous and lordly, to feed the man's glass and send him packing and return to his table with a good story, and instead he had been named. The stranger knew his name. The stranger had not flinched, had not stammered, had not gone red or pale, had not scrabbled for the shreds of his dignity the way men were supposed to when Rayland Vane looked down at them. The stranger had told him to sit down, and had made it sound less like a threat than a mercy. "What did you say to me?" Vane's voice had dropped and roughened. The good-humored bully was gone. Underneath was the other thing, the thing that lives under all men like Vane, the raw affront of a man who cannot conceive of a world in which he is not the largest object in the room. "I said sit down," Ashe repeated unhurried, "because you've mistaken this evening for one where you have the upper hand, and every word you say is digging that mistake deeper. I'm going to give you a way out of it. That's more courtesy than you've shown anyone since you walked in, so I'd take it if I were you. Go back to your table. Enjoy your dinner. And we can both pretend the last 2 minutes didn't happen." I have thought many times since about how much of himself Corvin Ashe was holding in check in that moment. Here was a man who had half a century before, put his own body in the path of a knife meant for a king. A man trained past the point where ordinary men break. A man who stood nearest the crown when the crown was in danger. And he was being called a delivery driver in a market stall coat by a soft-handed man who had never once in his life been in real danger of anything. He could have ended Vane with a sentence. He had, sitting in his coat, more genuine standing in the realm than every guest in that room put together. And he was offering the man an escape, a graceful exit, a chance to go back to his chair with his pride intact. That is a thing I did not understand at 23 and understand very well now. Real power almost never needs to be used, and the men who have it are forever offering the men who don't a way to stop before it has to be. Vane did not take it. "You insolent," he caught himself, glanced at the room, remembered his audience, and recalibrated into something he thought was more dangerous, cold. "You have no idea who I am, do you? No idea at all. I could buy this building. I could buy it tonight, the land under it, and have it turned into a car park by summer, and Delisle here." He did not look at Delisle, who stood rigid and gray at the edge of the light. "Delisle knows I could, don't you, Delisle? I have made and unmade men in this city larger than you'll ever dream of being. And you're going to sit in a coat like that at my window and tell me to take a way out." He leaned down, both hands on the white cloth now, into Ashe's space, and I saw several things at once. I saw Delisle take a step and stop. I saw the old sommelier in the pantry doorway put a hand over his mouth. And I saw, most of all, that Corvin Ashe did not move so much as a hair as the larger man loomed over him, did not lean back, did not tense, simply looked up into Vane's reddening face with an expression of almost sorrowful patience. "I don't take ways out, friend," Vane said, low and venomous. "I hand them out. Now get up and get out of my chair, and take your bottle and your little waiter and your 10-year-old coat back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Or I will have you removed, and I will make it my personal business that you never eat in a decent room in this city again." The room had gone very quiet, not the polite quiet of a fine restaurant, but the held-breath quiet of a place where everyone has realized that something is about to happen, and no one knows what. Forks lay still. Conversations had died mid-word. Even Vane's own party had stopped laughing. The young couple who laughed a half-second early had nothing to laugh at now, and sat with the fixed, uneasy grins of people who have followed a strong current out past their depth. And into that quiet Corvin Ashe rose. He did it without haste. He set his napkin on the table, he pushed back his chair, and he stood, and though he was no taller than Vane, though he wore the wrong coat and the plain watch and carried none of the armor of money, something changed in the air of the room the instant he was on his feet. It was the way he stood. I had seen it at the door and not understood it. I understood it now. It was the stillness I had watched by the window given a spine and a purpose. He stood the way a man stands who has stood between people and death and not moved, and every soul in that room felt it, even if not one of them could have told you what they felt. Vane, who was closest, felt it most. I watched the certainty falter in the big man's face. Just a flicker. Just the first hairline crack, as some old animal part of him, older than his money and his buildings and his made and unmade men, recognized that it was standing very close to something it had badly misjudged. "I'll ask you one more time to sit down," Ashe said quietly. "Not for my sake, for yours, because in about 2 minutes a telephone in the household office is going to ring, and a great many people are going to know exactly what you said to me tonight, and exactly what I am, and you are going to wish, Mr. Vane, with everything you own, that you had taken the way out when a man in a 10-year-old coat was still willing to give you one." It was, I see now, a warning of remarkable generosity. Ashe was telling him, in as many words, that a reckoning was already in motion, that the same office that had called an hour before would call again, that the princess's people watched over her honored guest more closely than any of us knew, and that the only thing left in Vane's power was to choose how badly the reckoning would fall on him. A wiser man would have heard it. Vane heard only a threat, and threats, to a man like Vane, were things you answered by getting bigger. A telephone, Vane repeated, and he laughed, but the laugh had a crack running through it now. You're going to have me undone by a telephone. Marvelous. Do you know how many telephones I have, friend? Do you know how many of them ring for me? He straightened, turned from Ashe as though the matter were beneath finishing himself, and snapped his fingers at the far side of the room, where two of the house's larger porters stood by the cloakroom, good, quiet men, one of them named Foss, whom I liked. You, and you, this gentleman is leaving. He's had too much of a very good wine and he's disturbing the room. See him out. Gently if he lets you, not gently if he doesn't. And here the evening reached the point where it might have become something ugly, and did not, and the reason it did not is the whole marrow of what I have been trying to tell you about Corvin Ashe. The two porters came. They did not want to come. I could see that on Foss's face. The reluctance of a decent man asked to do a thing he senses is wrong. But they came, because Vane was Vane and Delisle had not countermanded him. Delisle standing frozen in his impossible trap, unable to say the one sentence that would have stopped it all. And Corvin Ashe watched them come, these two big men crossing the candle-lit room toward him at the order of a bully, and he did not raise his hands, and he did not brace, and he did not do a single one of the things a lesser man would have done. What he did was speak to them, to the porters, not to Vane, in a voice pitched low and just for them, a voice I only caught because I was standing so near. "You're Foss," he said to the nearer one, "and your Pell is it, good. Listen to me, both of you, because I don't want either of you carrying tonight for the rest of your lives, and if you lay a hand on me you will. I'm not going to fight you. I've never in my life raised a hand to a working man doing a job he was ordered to do, and I'm not going to start with two decent fellows earning a wage. But I'm also not going to be put out of a door I have every right to walk through. So we're going to stand here, the three of us, like grown men, and we're going to wait 30 seconds, no more, for the thing that's coming. And when it comes, you're both going to be very glad you kept your hands to yourselves. Can you do that? Can you give me 30 seconds? I saw Foss look into Corvin Ashe's face. I do not know what he saw there, but he stopped. He stopped, and he put out a hand to stop Pell, and the two of them stood there in the middle of the room with the man they had been sent to remove, and did not remove him, and Vane made a strangled sound of pure outrage. "What are you? I gave you an order. Put him out. What is the matter with you people tonight?" Nobody moved. And then, exactly as Corvin Ashe had said it would, the telephone rang. Its old bell shivered up from under the podium, and in the held silence of that room it was the loudest sound in the world. I remember that Vane actually flinched at it. I remember that every head in the room turned toward the sound, and then slowly, back toward the man in the gray coat, because some understanding was beginning to move through the room like a change of pressure before a storm. The understanding that the stranger had known the telephone would ring, had promised it would ring, and here it was, ringing. I looked at Delisle, Delisle looked at me. And I understood that it was mine to answer, that this was the thing Corvin Ashe had given me at the table when he asked me to bring his wine, a place inside the door, a part to play, and I crossed to the podium on legs that did not feel like mine, and I lifted the heavy black receiver, and I said, into the silence of a room where a rich man stood with his mouth open, and two porters stood with their hands at their sides, and a sword of the household stood as calm as a stone in a stream. "Muniers, good evening." And the calm, clear woman's voice from before said, "This is the office of the household again. Please tell me, is Mr. Ashe being properly looked after this evening?" I looked across the room at Corvin Ashe. He was watching me, and there was, at the very corner of his mouth, the faintest ghost of the dry humor I had come to know in the last hour, as if to say, "Here it is then. Let's see how it lands." "No, madam," I heard myself say, and my voice carried because I did not try to keep it from carrying. I was done that night with silences that protect the wrong people. "No, he is not. There is a man here who has ordered him thrown out of the building. I think you had better send someone." There was the briefest pause on the line, and then the woman said in a voice that had gone very cool and very precise, "Someone is already on the way. They will be there in 4 minutes. Keep Mr. Ashe safe until they arrive. And young man," a beat, "thank you for telling me the truth. Not everyone in that room did tonight." The line went dead. I set the receiver down, and into the ringing silence I said the only thing there was to say. "They're sending someone," I said. 4 minutes. 4 minutes is not a long time. But 4 minutes in a silent room, with a rich man's certainty coming apart in front of 100 candles, is a very long time indeed, and I watched every second of it cross Rayland Vane's face. His first instinct was contempt, because contempt was his native country. "Someone," he sneered. "You're all mad, the lot of you. You've let a tramp in a coat put a spell on you." But even as he said it, his eyes were moving, the inventory-taking eyes, and they were no longer certain of the count. He was a man who had spent his life reading rooms for advantage, and this room had stopped making sense to him. Delisle would not meet his eye. The porters had gone to stand not near Vane but near Ashe, a small shift of allegiance that a man like Vane would feel in his spine even if he could not have named it. And the stranger, the man in the gray coat, simply stood at his window with the river behind him and waited, calm as Sunday, having promised a thing that was now visibly coming true. "Who did you call?" Vane said. The question came out before he could stop it, and it was a different Vane who asked it, quieter, the bluster thinning, the first cold thread of real doubt working through him. "Who is the household? What are you playing at?" He turned on Delisle. "Delisle. Delisle, look at me. Who is this man?" And now Delisle at last spoke, because the reckoning was 4 minutes away, and there was no longer any honor to protect by silence. Only a man walking off a cliff who might be given the mercy of knowing it before he fell. Delisle drew himself up, and he said, in the voice of a man reading a sentence, "Mr. Vane, the gentleman at the window is a guest of the royal household. His table was booked by the private office of Her Royal Highness the Princess Adela in her own hand, as an honor. I turned him away at the door earlier tonight, to my very great shame, because I made the same mistake you are making now. I would counsel you, sir, with everything I have learned in the last hour, to say nothing further, and to sit down, and to pray that the people who are coming are in a forgiving humor." The name of the princess went through the room like a dropped glass. I heard it repeated at 3 tables, a whisper leaping candle to candle, the princess, the household, her own hand, and I watched it reach Rayland Vane and go into him and change the shape of his face. Because Vane, for all his crudeness, was not a stupid man. A stupid man does not build what he had built. He understood in the space of a breath the size of the thing he had walked into. He had, in front of a room full of the city's people, loomed over and threatened and ordered the removal of the personal guest of a princess of the realm. A man the crown had sent one of its offices to protect, twice, in a single evening. And whatever Corvin Ashe himself turned out to be, that alone was a catastrophe from which no amount of money could simply be spent free. That's Vane's voice had lost its floor. "That's absurd. A guest of the in that coat. You expect me to," but he did not believe himself any more. I could hear it. The words were reflex, the last twitches of a certainty already dead. "This is a setup. This is some kind of—" "Sit down, Mr. Vane," said Corvin Ashe, for the third and final time, and this time there was no mercy left in it to refuse, only a flat and final instruction. "You've done the damage. The only question left is whether you compound it. Sit down and be quiet, and when they come, tell the truth, and it will go easier on you than you deserve." And Rayland Vane, the man who did not take ways out but handed them out, the man who could buy the building and the land beneath it, sat down. He sat down in the nearest chair, which was not even his own, a chair at a stranger's table, and the stranger whose table it was moved his own body aside without a word to let the great man fall into it. And Vane sat there with his hands loose in his lap, and his eyes on nothing, a hollowed-out man waiting for 4 minutes to run out. They ran out. The door of Muniers opened for the last time that night, and the cold came in, and with it came the reckoning that Corvin Ashe had promised. And it did not come the way any of us expected, because we had all of us, even now, even after everything, still half imagined that the important thing would look important. Two people came through the door. The first was a man in a dark, plain, beautifully cut suit, no uniform, no insignia, a man who moved through the vestibule with the same economical stillness I had learned to recognize in Ashe himself. Another of them, I understood at once, another sword, come at speed and yet unhurried, his eyes sweeping the room and finding Ashe and Vane and the porters and reading the whole scene in a single pass the way a surgeon reads a wound. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. Men like that do not announce themselves. The announcing is done by the way the air changes when they come in. And the second person through the door, small, unhurried, wrapped against the cold in a dark coat as plain as Ashe's own, with silver in her hair and an unremarkable face that half the room would have passed on the street without a second glance, was the Princess Adela. She had come herself. That was the thing none of us had reckoned with, the thing that not even Delisle in his darkest imagining had dared to fear. When her office learned that the man she had honored, the man who had bought back her family's crown with his blood, was at that very moment being threatened with removal from the room by a bully, she had not simply sent someone. She had risen from wherever she was and put on a plain coat and come to Muniers herself, on the cold Friday of Corvin Ashe's name day, to stand beside him. And she had come without ceremony, without a herald, without any of the trappings that would have told a room like ours who she was, because she understood the same thing Ashe understood, the thing the whole evening had been trying to teach us, that the true measure of anyone is taken in exactly the moments when they believe no one important is watching. She stopped just inside the door. She took in the room the frozen guests, the gray maître d', the porters, the young host at his podium, the great rail and Vane sitting hollow in a borrowed chair. And then her eyes found the man in the gray wool coat at the window, and her plain, unremarkable face did a thing that made my throat close. It softened entirely into the face of a person looking at someone they love. "Corvin," she said, just his name, across the length of the silent room in the ordinary warm voice of an old friend. "They tell me it's your name day, and I've heard the most dreadful things about how they've treated you. I had rather hoped to find you halfway through the good bottle." And Corvin Ashe, the sword of the household, the Cross of Valour, the man who had not bent an inch to Delisle's contempt or Vane's threats or the two porters sent to throw him out. Corvin Ashe inclined his head to the small woman in the plain coat, and there was in his weathered face a warmth I had not seen there all evening, the warmth of 50 years of a bond no coat could hide and no bully could touch. "Your Highness," he said, "I was saving you a glass. If you have never watched 100 people understand a thing at the same instant, I can tell you it is like watching wind move across a field of grain. It began at the tables nearest the door and it swept the length of the room, table by table, the truth arriving and bending each person forward as it passed. The princess, it's the princess. She came herself. And by the time it reached the center of the room, where Rayland Vane sat in his borrowed chair, there was not a soul in Muniers who did not know exactly what had happened and exactly what they had all been part of. They had watched a princess of the realm walk into the room in a plain coat, to stand beside the man in the gray coat that Delisle had turned into the cold, and Vane had ordered thrown out. And now, they understood that the whole evening had been a test they had not known they were taking, and that most of them had failed it, and that only the young host at the podium and 2 reluctant porters had in the end come out of it with anything to be proud of. The princess crossed the room to Ashe, and she did not glide, and she did not perform. She walked like a woman going to an old friend, which is what she was. She took both his hands in hers, the small plain hands taking the weathered ones, and she looked up into his face. 50 years, she said quietly, but not so quietly that the room could not hear, because she had decided, I think in that moment, that the room should hear, that the room had earned an education. 50 years, Corvin, and you still won't let anyone make a fuss of you. I arrange one dinner. One quiet dinner, one window, one good bottle for the man who, her voice caught just slightly, and she mastered it, for the man who stood between my brother and a knife when we were children, and gave his own blood for it and asked for nothing then or since. One dinner, and they turn you from the door because your coat is old, and a man threatens to have you thrown into the street. She turned, still holding his hands, and for the first time she looked directly at Rayland Vane. You would be the man, I take it. Vane got to his feet. It is a strange thing to watch a large and powerful man make himself small, but that is what happened. Vane, who had loomed over the whole room an hour before, seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit as he stood to face the small woman in the plain coat. Your Highness, he began, and his voice, that instrument he had used all his life to fill rooms and unmake men, came out thin and unsteady. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea. If I had known who this gentleman was, I would never have. No, said the Princess Adela, and it was not loud and it was not cruel, but it stopped him as though she had struck him. No, Mr. Vane, that is precisely the thing. You would never have. If you had known he was a sword of the household, if you had known there was a princess coming, if you had known his coat hid the Cross of Valour and not a delivery man, you would have bowed and scraped and offered him your own chair. I have no doubt of it at all. She let that sit. But you did not know. And so you saw a quiet man in an old coat, alone, no armor of money about him, no one important watching as you thought, and you decided he was a nobody, and you were cruel to him because you believed there would be no cost. That is who you are, Mr. Vane, when you think no one is watching. That is who all of you are. Her eyes moved once across the whole silent room, across the financiers and the couples in the right coats, and not one of them could hold her gaze. The crown does not honor Corvin Ashe because of what he is wearing tonight. It honors him because of what he did on a morning 50 years ago when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and no one important was watching him either, only a boy, and a little girl, and a man with a knife. He did not step in front of that blade for a reward. He stepped in front of it because that is who he is when he thinks no one important is watching. And that, gentlemen, is the whole of the difference between him and every one of you. She released Ashe's hands. She turned back to Vane, and her voice, when she spoke again, had gone practical, almost gentle, which was somehow the most frightening thing of all. You will not be arrested tonight, Mr. Vane. Corvin would not want it, and I will not do to a room full of frightened diners the thing you would happily have done to one man. But hear me. You threatened before all these people, a holder of the Cross of Valour and a guest of my household. That is not a thing that will be forgotten, and it is not a thing that your money will buy back, because the people who matter, the ones you spend your whole life trying to impress, will hear of it by morning, and they will know exactly what you are. You have done the damage. You did it to yourself. Now go home and sit with it, and ask yourself whether the man you were tonight is the man you want to be when the next quiet stranger in an old coat crosses your path, because there will be a next one. There always is. Rayland Vane stood for a moment longer. I think he searched for something to say, some sentence that would put the floor back under him, some purchase, some leverage, the way he always found leverage, and for the first time in his life there was none. His money could not reach into that room. His buildings could not help him. He had met at last a kind of standing that could not be bought, standing over another kind of standing that could not be bought, and both of them had found him wanting. He inclined his head, a stiff, unpracticed motion, a man who had not bowed to anyone in decades, and he gathered his stunned party with a small, broken gesture, and he walked out of Munier's into the cold, and I never saw him in that room again. For a moment after the door closed, the whole restaurant simply sat in the wreckage of its own silence. Then from somewhere near the back, I never learned who began it, a single pair of hands started to clap, and another joined, and another, until the whole room was on its feet applauding, not the departure of Rayland Vane, but the man at the window, and Corvin Ashe, who had borne the contempt of 2 men and the threats of a third without a flicker, looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time all evening, and raised one hand in a small deflecting motion, as if to say, "Enough, please sit, it's only dinner." The princess laughed at his discomfort, a real laugh, warm, that took 10 years off her plain, unremarkable face, and said something to him too low for the room to catch, and he almost smiled, and the applause finally settled, and the evening began at last to be the evening it had been meant to be all along. There was still the matter of Delisle. He had stood through the whole of it at the edge of the candlelight, and now, as the princess turned from Ashe, Delisle came forward, and I will say this for him until the day I die. He did not hide, and he did not make excuses, and he did not try to buy his way clear with charm, though charm was the tool he had lived by. He came and he stood before the Princess Adela and Corvin Ashe both, and he bowed deeply this time, all the way from the waist, and when he straightened his eyes were wet. "Your Highness, Mr. Ashe, I turned this gentleman from my door tonight because his coat was old and I judged him a nobody. I have spent 30 years in this room believing I could read a man's worth at a glance, and tonight I have learned that everything I believed I could read was the least true thing about anyone. I do not ask to be forgiven. I ask only to be allowed to serve Mr. Ashe the finest dinner this house has ever set before a soul, and to spend whatever years I have left in this trade remembering what I learned at my own door tonight." The princess said nothing. She looked at Ashe. It was, plainly, his to answer, not hers. And Corvin Ashe regarded the old maître for a long moment, and then he said the thing that I have kept, of everything from that night, the closest to my heart. "Mr. Delisle," he said, "I told you earlier that you said one true thing tonight. You've now said 2. A man who can stand in front of the person he wronged and name the wrong plainly and ask for nothing but the chance to do better, that's a rarer thing than you'd think, and it's worth more than a spotless record. I'll take the dinner. And I'll tell you what I told the young man here. You're not the mistake you made at the door. You're what you do about it after. So let's have no more of the wet eyes, and let's have that dinner, and let's set 2 more places. One for Her Highness, if she'll stay, and one for this young man when his shift ends, because he was the only person in this room tonight who told the truth into a telephone when it would have been easier to keep his mouth shut, and I find I'd like to know how he turns out." And so it was that on the coldest Friday of that winter, in the finest room in the capital, a princess of the realm and a sword of the household and an old maître who had learned something, and a 23-year-old floor host who had learned more, all sat down together at the window table over the river, and were served the best dinner Muniers ever made, and it was the finest evening of my career. Exactly as I told you at the beginning, though it began with the worst hour of it. I want to tell you the small things, because it is the small things I have kept. I have kept the way Corvin Ashe insisted, when the food came, on thanking each person who set a plate before him by name, having somehow learned all their names in the course of an evening in which he was supposed to be the one being served. I have kept the way the Princess Adela ate her dinner like anyone, and asked me about my mother, and remembered, when she rose to go, to thank Foss and Pell the porters by name for keeping their hands to themselves when a foolish man told them not to. I have kept the way Delisle at the end of the night took down the leather reservation book, the theater, the prop, and wrote inside its front cover in his slanted hand, a single line for every host who would ever stand at that podium after me to read, "Serve the person, not the coat." It is there still. I have checked. And I have kept, most of all, what Corvin Ashe said to me at the door when he finally left, near midnight, the princess long gone in her plain coat and her plain car, the room emptied, the candles guttering. He put on the gray wool coat that had caused the whole of it, put it on without a flicker of self-consciousness, the same coat, the wrong coat, the coat that had been right all along, and he stood at the door where I had turned him away 7 hours before, and he offered me his hand, and I took it, and it was a hard, warm, steady hand, the hand of a man who had once put himself in the way of a knife. "You'll do," he said. "You'll do fine. You had a bad hour and a better night, and you learned the lesson most men in your trade never learn, that the door is not there to keep people out. It's there to decide what kind of house you are. You made the wrong call at the start and the right one at the end, and that's the whole of a good man, more or less, to be better at the end of the night than you were at the start. Keep at it." He settled the coat on his shoulders. "And the next time a quiet fellow in an old coat comes to your door and something in you says he's a nobody, you stop, and you look again, and you remember me. Because the important ones almost never look important. That's rather the point of them." Then he stepped out into the cold, a plain man in a plain coat, indistinguishable in the dark from any other soul walking home along the river. And I stood in the warm, lit doorway and watched him go. And I understood that I had spent the finest evening of my life in the company of one of the great men of the realm, and that I would never once have known it if a telephone had not rung, and that the whole meaning of the man was contained precisely in that fact. I am not 23 anymore. I run my own room now, a good room, not so grand as Munier's, but a room I am proud of, and I stand at my own door most nights and greet the people who come. And every host I have ever trained I have trained the same way. I do not teach them to read coats. I teach them the opposite. I tell them the story of the coldest Friday of a long-ago winter, of the man in the gray wool coat who was turned into the cold and stood by the window and waited, of the two men who mistook the wrapping for the thing inside, of the princess who came herself in a plain coat, because the true measure of anyone is taken when they think no one important is watching. And then I take them to my own door, and I show them the line I have written inside my own reservation book, in my own hand, the line I carried out of Munier's and have never once regretted. Serve the person, not the coat. Because you never know, standing at your door on a cold night, which of the plain, quiet strangers coming in from the dark once stood between a king and a knife, and gave his blood for it, and asked for nothing, then or ever, but a good table by a window, and a glass of something worth saving, and a young fool at the door who might, if he was lucky, be given one night in which to learn to look again.